What if the very people who humiliated you were forced to answer to you in a court of law? What if the tables turned so dramatically that those who abused their power suddenly found themselves at your mercy? Fate has a way of working in mysterious, sometimes poetic ways. Sometimes, justice comes not in the form of vengeance but in the form of undeniable irony, an irony so powerful it forces those who once wielded power recklessly to face the weight of their own actions. This is the story of one such moment, a moment where power was stripped from those who had misused it and returned to the very person they sought to silence. A woman, simply minding her own business, unfairly arrested for a crime that did not exist. But in a twist no one saw coming, she would soon find herself in a position of ultimate authority, overseeing the case of the very officers who had tried to break her spirit. Imagine being handcuffed, humiliated, treated like a criminal while knowing, deep in your heart, that you have done nothing wrong. Imagine the anger, the frustration, the disbelief. Now, imagine the same officers who did this to you sitting in a courtroom, no longer in control, their fates resting in your hands. Would you be able to remain impartial? Would you seek revenge? Or would you show them the very justice they had denied you? This story is more than just a legal battle. It is a battle of principles. It is about the resilience of the human spirit, about standing tall in the face of injustice, and about how, sometimes, the universe has a way of setting things right in ways we could never predict. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Would you choose to be merciful, or would you let the full force of justice take its course? Comment below with your thoughts, and let's discuss what real justice looks like together. And before we get into this incredible story, don't forget to like and share this video. Because stories like these need to be told. The more people hear about injustices like this, the more we can push for change. Now, let's begin. The day was like any other. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches, casting warm golden hues over the quiet park in Charlotte, North Carolina. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and the occasional sound of laughter from children playing in the distance created a serene backdrop. The smell of freshly cut grass lingered in the air, a reminder of the simple joys of a peaceful afternoon. Camille Anderson sat alone on a wooden bench, absorbed in the world within the pages of her thick hardcover book. The weight of her demanding job as a civil rights attorney often left little time for leisure, and these rare moments of solitude were something she treasured. She let the words transport her, momentarily escaping the realities of her work, cases that often brought frustration, heartbreak, and an unrelenting drive to seek justice. The peace didn't last. The abrupt screech of tires against pavement shattered the tranquility. Camille's head lifted slightly, her eyes narrowing as a police cruiser came to a sharp stop near the curb. The sound alone was enough to cause a shift in the park's atmosphere. Conversations hushed, and a few curious glances turned toward the vehicle. Even the birds seemed to fall silent for a brief moment. Two officers exited the car, their movements calculated, their expressions unreadable. Detective Carter, tall and broad-shouldered, adjusted his belt as he surveyed the area. Officer Daniels, younger and leaner, stood beside him with an air of rigid authority. Their eyes swept across the park, but it became clear almost instantly who had caught their attention. Their gaze locked onto Camille. She was simply sitting, reading, minding her own business. Yet, in their eyes, she was someone to be questioned. Someone who didn't quite belong. Camille's grip on her book tightened slightly, but she remained composed. This wasn't the first time she had felt the weight of scrutiny, and she knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be the last. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" Camille looked up from her book, calm but cautious. She recognized the tone, the way authority wrapped itself in a question that wasn't really a question. She'd heard it before, in courtrooms, in client testimonies, in history itself. She exhaled quietly, closing the book carefully, marking her place as if she expected to return to it in just a moment. "We got a report of suspicious activity," the taller officer said, his voice clipped and professional, yet carrying an edge she had learned to recognize. "Suspicious?" Camille asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm sitting here reading a book." She held it up, a clear display of its harmlessness, as if words on a page could erase whatever preconceptions had led them to her. "Can we see some ID?" the second officer asked, his posture stiff, one hand resting near his belt. Her pulse quickened. She had seen this scenario too many times before, on the news, in legal cases, and quiet conversations where people shared stories of encounters that left them shaken but not surprised. "What exactly am I being accused of?" she asked, her voice measured, controlled. "It's routine," the officer replied, as though that explained everything. Routine. The word sat heavily in the air. Routine for whom? For her, a woman simply enjoying a peaceful afternoon? Or for them, accustomed to questioning people who, for no reason other than circumstance, fit an unspoken profile? She reached into her bag and pulled out her ID, handing it over with steady hands. Around her, the murmurs of onlookers grew, quiet but present, like the first signs of an approaching storm. She had a choice: comply, challenge, or prepare for something worse. And the officers had a choice too. But had they already made it? The tension in the air grew thick as Camille handed over her ID, watching as the officers examined it longer than necessary. The taller officer, Carter, squinted at the card, then back at her face, as if searching for something to justify his suspicion. The younger officer, Daniels, shifted his stance, fingers twitching near his belt. Camille had seen this unfold before, too many times to count. "What exactly is the issue?" she asked again, her voice calm but firm. "We're just doing our job, ma'am," Carter said, his tone dismissive. "Mind telling us why you're here?" Camille's jaw tightened. "I'm reading a book in a public park." "Since when is that a crime?" The murmurs from the growing crowd swelled. A few onlookers had stopped their afternoon strolls, their conversations hushed as they watched the scene unfold. A young man pulled out his phone, holding it up just enough to start recording. "Ma'am, we need you to stand up," Daniels said, taking a small step forward. The order wasn't a request. Camille hesitated. She knew that no matter what she said, this wasn't going to end well. "Am I being detained?" she asked. Carter exhaled sharply, as if annoyed she even had the audacity to challenge him. "You're being uncooperative. Stand up now." Camille swallowed her frustration and stood, the weight of every injustice she'd ever fought pressing on her chest. As soon as she was on her feet, Carter reached for her wrist. "What are you doing?" she demanded, instinctively pulling back. The reaction was all the justification they needed. "Stop resisting." Carter barked, grabbing her arm tighter. Daniels was already moving in, his handcuffs clicking open. The voices in the crowd grew louder. "She wasn't doing anything," an older woman shouted. "Y'all just looking for trouble," another man called out. But the officers weren't listening. Camille felt her wrist twist as the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around it. The click echoed in her ears, final and absolute. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice," Daniels announced, though the words felt empty. Camille clenched her jaw. She knew better than to argue further. This wasn't about the law, it was about control. "This is wrong," someone in the crowd yelled, their voice filled with outrage. "Get your hands off her," another voice joined in. The bystanders had grown in number, their anger simmering. Phones were up, cameras recording. Camille hoped that someone, somewhere, would see the truth. Carter tightened his grip on her arm and led her toward the patrol car. The world blurred around her. The shame, the helplessness, she had fought for others in situations like this, but now, she was the one being dragged away. A young woman in the crowd stepped forward, her phone held high. "We got you on camera. This is unlawful." Camille turned her head, locking eyes with the woman for just a moment. There was an unspoken understanding. A silent plea. The woman nodded. She would not let this injustice go unseen. The ride to the police station was suffocatingly silent. Camille sat in the back of the cruiser, her wrists aching from the tightness of the handcuffs. The hard plastic seat was cold against her skin, and every bump in the road sent a jolt of pain up her arms. She stared out the window, her reflection staring back at her, a face that had spent years fighting for justice, now trapped in the very system she had spent her career challenging. The irony was almost laughable. The station was busy when they arrived, officers moving about, phones ringing, doors slamming. The fluorescent lighting was harsh, washing the life from everything it touched. Carter led her inside without a word, his grip still firm on her arm. The moment she stepped through the doors, she felt every set of eyes in the room land on her. Some with curiosity, some with indifference, and others with a quiet satisfaction that made her stomach turn. "Stand here," Daniels ordered as he gestured toward a wall. Camille obeyed, forcing herself to remain composed. A camera flashed. Her mugshot. A humiliating moment immortalized. "Remove your jewelry and any personal items," another officer instructed, holding out a plastic bag. Camille's hands trembled as she removed her earrings, her watch, and the simple silver bracelet her mother had given her years ago. She placed them carefully into the bag, knowing they would be returned, but feeling as though she were surrendering pieces of herself. "Shoes off," Carter added. She bent down, slipping off her flats, her feet meeting the cold floor with a shiver. The dehumanization process was in full swing. "You must be proud of yourselves," she muttered, barely above a whisper. Carter scoffed. "Should have just cooperated." Camille swallowed her anger. She knew their game. Knew that responding with anything but silence would only make things worse. But her silence didn't protect her from the jeers. "Didn't take you for the rebellious type, Ms. Anderson," one officer snickered. "Guess even lawyers think they're above the law." She turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. "I know the law," she said evenly. "And I know this isn't about it." He smirked, shaking his head before walking away. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with an unspoken understanding that this wasn't just an arrest, it was a message. "Follow me," a female officer finally instructed, leading Camille down a dimly lit hallway. The wall seemed to close in around her. The cell was small, barely more than a concrete box with a metal bench. The door clanked shut behind her, the sound reverberating in her bones. She sat, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. The room smelled of stale air and faint traces of disinfectant. Time slowed. She replayed every moment in her mind, dissecting their actions, their words, every justification they had clung to. Minutes turned to hours. The humiliation settled deep, but so did something else, something stronger. This wasn't the end. This was a turning point. She had spent her career fighting for others. Now, she would fight for herself. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The courtroom was silent as Camille stepped forward, her black robe flowing as she took her seat at the bench. The weight of the moment settled heavily around her, yet she remained composed. The irony was not lost on her, nor on the men sitting at the defense table. Carter and Daniels sat rigid, their uniforms neatly pressed, their faces pale. For the first time since their fateful encounter in the park, they were not in control. She let the silence stretch, watching as realization dawned on their faces. The same men who had humiliated her, who had thrown her into a cold holding cell without justification, now sat before her, awaiting judgment. She could see it in their eyes, the slow, creeping understanding that this time, they were the ones being scrutinized. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice steady and unwavering. The courtroom stirred as everyone took their places. The prosecution stood, laying out the charges: misconduct, abuse of power, wrongful arrest. The evidence was damning. The video from the park, the testimonies from witnesses, even their own reports contradicted the justifications they had given at the time. Camille listened intently, her expression unreadable. She had spent years fighting for justice, but now, she had to be its embodiment. The defense attorney rose, his voice carefully measured. He argued that the officers had simply been following protocol, that their actions were based on a reasonable suspicion. But Camille knew better. "Reasonable suspicion?" she interrupted. "Tell me, counselor, what exactly was suspicious about a woman sitting alone in a public park reading a book?" The attorney faltered. The officers were responding to a call. A call that was never verified, she cut in. A call that conveniently justified their actions but had no basis in reality. Daniel shifted in his seat, his hands clasped tightly together. Carter stared down at the table, his jaw clenched. Neither of them spoke. The prosecution proceeded to call witnesses. The young woman who had recorded the arrest took the stand, her voice strong as she recounted the events of that day. More testimonies followed, each one painting a picture of officers who had abused their power, who had acted not out of duty, but out of bias. The more they spoke, the more the officers seemed to shrink into their seats. When it was time for Carter and Daniels to take the stand, the tension in the room thickened. Carter went first, his voice carefully controlled, but there was no confidence behind his words. He struggled to justify his actions, to explain why he had deemed Camille a threat. Each question chipped away at his composure, leaving him exposed. Daniels fared no better. His responses were clipped, evasive. He glanced at his partner, but there was no reassurance there. They were alone in this, facing the consequences of their choices. As closing arguments were made, Camille sat back, letting the weight of the case settle over the room. She had listened. She had weighed the facts. And now, justice would be served. She took a deep breath before speaking. This case is about more than just one incident. It is about accountability. It is about the trust we place in those who are sworn to protect and serve. When that trust is broken, it is the duty of this court to ensure it is not ignored. She looked at the defendants, their faces drawn and exhausted. The evidence has spoken. The testimonies have spoken. And now, this court will speak. The gavel struck, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted once and for all. Justice is not always immediate. It is not always swift or even fair in the way it unfolds. But when it does come, it carries a weight that cannot be ignored. Camille's story is one of patience, resilience, and the power of truth. What happened to her in the park was not just a personal violation, it was a reflection of a larger issue, a system that too often fails the very people it is meant to protect. But justice, when pursued with determination, has a way of finding its rightful place. This case was not just about her. It was about accountability. About a system that needed to be reminded that power is not an unbreakable shield. That those who wear a badge must be held to the same standard they impose on others. Camille did not seek revenge. She sought justice, and in doing so, she gave voice to those who had been silenced before her. There are moments in life where we have to decide whether to accept what is wrong or to fight for what is right. Camille made her choice, and through her actions, she set a precedent. Her victory was not just her own, it belonged to every person who had ever been wrongly accused, unfairly treated, or silenced by authority. The power dynamic shifted, not because of vengeance, but because justice was demanded and delivered. This story is a reminder that we must remain vigilant. That we must not accept injustice simply because it is routine. If we do nothing, nothing changes. But when we stand up, when we push back against wrongdoing, we force the system to correct itself. It may take time. It may take courage. But it is always worth it. What do you think? Should those in power face harsher consequences when they abuse their authority? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in the power of accountability, share this story, because justice must never be silent. What do you think? Should these officers have faced harsher consequences? Should justice be stricter to ensure accountability? Your voice matters, and we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Every conversation we start is a step toward meaningful change. If this story resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Share this video with your friends, family, and community. The more people see what injustice looks like, the harder it is to ignore. When we spread awareness, we create momentum. When we raise our voices, we demand better. Justice doesn't just happen, it starts with us. It starts with calling out wrongdoing when we see it, holding those in power accountable, and standing up for what is right. Together, we can push for a world where fairness isn't the exception but the rule. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter, and let's keep this conversation going. Change begins with awareness, and awareness begins with you.